Forging a signature is a decision that was not made in a single moment. It happens in inches. That's the sentence I keep coming back to. I'm William. I'm 38 now, and I've spent a good part of my life pretending the worst thing I ever did was make a bad choice when I was young. That's the cleaned-up version. The truth is uglier, smaller, and a lot more ordinary than people imagine. This happened when I was 24. My mother had just died after a long stretch of hospital visits, unpaid bills, and phone calls I stopped answering because every one of them wanted money. I was working at a hardware store during the day and drinking away most nights because being awake felt expensive. My younger sister was still in college, and I had somehow become the person everyone looked at when rent was due. The problem with desperation is that it doesn't announce itself dramatically. It settles into your life like damp air. You wake up counting numbers. You go to sleep hearing them. $43 in checking. $200 overdue on electricity. $900 for rent. A final notice folded in half on the kitchen counter. A week after the funeral, I found an envelope in one of my mother's desk drawers. Inside was a check from an insurance reimbursement, nothing huge, but enough to keep everything from collapsing for another month. The check was made out to her. She was already gone. I remember holding that paper and feeling something cold move through me. Not panic. Not grief. Something more practical. My first thought wasn't I shouldn't do this. It was, would this even work? That thought scared me more than the idea itself. I sat there for almost an hour staring at her old notebooks. Grocery lists, reminders, birthday cards she never sent. Her signature was everywhere. Same looping W, same slant at the end. I knew it by heart because I'd watched her sign permission slips and school forms my whole childhood. That night, for the first time in my life, I seriously considered becoming the kind of person who could fake his dead mother's name. I didn't decide that night. That's the part people usually get wrong. They imagine a switch flipping, good person, bad person. It wasn't like that. For 3 days I carried that check folded inside my wallet like it was burning through the leather. Every time I opened it for coffee or cigarettes, I felt it there. A quiet question. I kept trying to invent respectable alternatives. Maybe the insurance company would reissue it. Maybe my landlord would wait. Maybe the power company wouldn't actually shut anything off. But every conversation I had that week made the walls feel closer. My sister called crying because her campus account was frozen. My landlord taped another notice to the door. I started counting coins before buying bread. By the 4th night, I stopped asking whether it was wrong. I started asking whether I could do it well enough not to be noticed. That was the moment something changed in me, not the crime itself, but the way my mind began solving it like a practical problem instead of a moral one. Preparation started with denial. I told myself I wasn't planning anything, I was only seeing what was possible. That sounded less criminal in my head. After work I went back to my mother's apartment and opened every drawer in her desk. Old tax forms, greeting cards, utility checks, medical paperwork. I spread them across the kitchen table and studied her signature like it was evidence in a case. She had habits I'd never noticed while she was alive. The first letter leaned forward harder than the rest. The second name always tightened near the middle. On rushed forms the last stroke dipped downward. Little inconsistencies that made it human. I practiced on junk mail first. Then on the backs of grocery receipts. Page after page. My hand cramped. At first it looked childish and obvious. Too careful. Too slow. The more I tried to imitate her, the worse it got. Around midnight I realized the trick wasn't copying perfectly. It was making it look casual, like a woman signing something she'd already signed 100 times before. Once I crossed into actual planning, everything got strangely methodical. I started thinking about details I'd never have noticed before. Ink color. Paper pressure. Whether a bank teller would compare the signature to older records or just glance at it. I hated how quickly my brain adapted to that kind of thinking. The next afternoon I bought 2 cheap pens from a pharmacy and spent half an hour in the parking lot testing them on receipts. One bled too much. The other dragged. My mother always used dark blue ink, not black, and suddenly that felt important enough to matter. I also needed a story. If anyone asked, I'd say I was handling her affairs, still sorting paperwork after the funeral. That part was true, which made the lie feel easier to carry. What I didn't plan for was how physical the fear would become. My stomach felt hollow all day. My hands kept going cold. Every time I imagined stepping up to the counter, I heard my own voice sounding thin and suspicious. But I kept practicing anyway. The morning I decided to do it, I almost turned around twice. It was gray outside, one of those heavy afternoons where everything feels flatter than normal. I left work early, told my manager I had to deal with funeral paperwork. That wasn't even a lie. The check was in the inside pocket of my jacket, and I kept touching it every few minutes to make sure it was still there. I sat in my car outside the bank for nearly 20 minutes. People kept walking in and out, an older man with a cane, a woman balancing a toddler on her hip, a teenager depositing cash from a fast food job. Normal people doing normal things. That made me feel worse. I wasn't planning some dramatic heist. I was about to stand in line under fluorescent lights and pretend nothing was wrong. Before I went in, I signed my mother's name one last time on the back of an old receipt. It looked steady. That frightened me more than if it had looked terrible. Inside, the bank felt absurdly ordinary. That almost undid me. There was soft music I couldn't identify, a little bowl of mints by the entrance, and the air conditioning turned up high enough to make my arms cold. I remember thinking, how can a place this normal feel like a courtroom? There were 3 people ahead of me. Every second in that line stretched. I kept replaying small things in my head: don't talk too much, don't rush, don't over-explain. The woman in front of me argued about an overdraft fee, and I stood there nodding like I belonged. When it was my turn, the teller was younger than I expected. Maybe 22. She had tired eyes and a practiced smile. I slid the check over and said I was handling some paperwork after my mother's death. Even saying the word death made my throat tighten. She glanced at the check, then at her screen. For a few seconds her fingers stopped moving. That tiny pause felt louder than any alarm. She looked up and asked for identification. That wasn't unexpected, but hearing it still made my pulse jump hard enough that I felt it in my neck. I handed over my driver's license and tried not to move too quickly. My fingers were colder than the plastic. She studied the screen, then looked back at the check. "Was this signed by your mother before she passed?" she asked. That was the first moment I had to actually lie out loud. I said yes. Quietly. Calmly, I hoped. I added that I'd been sorting through paperwork all week and found it in a drawer. That part, at least, was true. The words came out steady, but inside I could feel adrenaline building like pressure in a sealed pipe. Then she stood up and walked toward the office in the back. I can still remember the sound of her shoes on the tile. My first thought was simple and immediate: leave now. But leaving would have said everything. So I stayed there, trying to look like a grieving son instead of a man waiting to be exposed. Those 2 minutes felt longer than the funeral. I stood at the counter staring at a poster about retirement accounts because I needed somewhere harmless to put my eyes. My heartbeat was so loud I was sure the woman beside me could hear it. Every small sound, the printer, the phone ringing, someone laughing in the back, felt sharpened. I started building explanations in my head. Maybe I'd say I misunderstood. Maybe I'd claimed she had signed it earlier, and I didn't know there was a problem. Maybe I'd just walk out and keep walking until I reached the car. Then the teller came back. She sat down, gave me a smaller, more careful smile, and said they needed me to endorse it again in front of her. My stomach dropped. For half a second I thought she knew. My hand felt heavy as stone when I picked up the pen. I wrote my mother's name slowly, then realized halfway through I was being too careful. I forced myself to loosen up. She watched the whole thing without saying a word, When I handed the pen back, I could feel sweat between my fingers. She compared the fresh signature to the one already on the check, then to something on her screen. Her expression didn't change. That almost made it worse. If she had frowned or looked suspicious, at least I'd know what I was dealing with. Instead, she just typed. A few seconds later, she asked how I wanted the money. That question hit me so unexpectedly I almost didn't answer. For a moment I thought I'd misheard her. Then I said I'd take part in cash and the rest deposited. My voice sounded normal, which felt unreal. While she counted bills, an older man at the next window started joking with another teller about baseball. Somebody behind me was talking about mortgage rates. The whole room kept moving as if my life hadn't narrowed into a single breath. When she slid the envelope across the counter, I actually hesitated before touching it. It felt heavier than paper should. I thanked her, turned around, and forced myself to walk, not run, toward the door. The moment I got outside, my legs felt unreliable. I made it to the car, shut the door, and just sat there with both hands on the steering wheel. My whole body started shaking. Not dramatically, small, hard tremors I couldn't stop. My mouth was dry. My shirt was damp across the back. For almost a minute I couldn't even start the engine. I should have felt relieved. Instead I felt something stranger, a sharp, almost electric rush that sat halfway between terror and triumph. I had done it. That thought landed with more force than the money itself. The bills in the envelope suddenly felt secondary. What unsettled me was realizing how ordinary the world looked afterward. Cars still passed. Someone pushed a shopping cart across the lot. A kid dropped an ice cream and started crying. Nothing outside had changed. Inside me, something had. On the drive home I kept checking the rearview mirror. Every car behind me looked like it might belong to someone coming to stop me. No one did. But fear had already climbed in beside me. That night I paid the rent, covered the electric bill, and sent money to my sister. She thanked me over the phone and cried with relief. She said, "Mom would have wanted that." I remember staring at the wall after she hung up. That sentence landed harder than anything that happened in the bank. For the next few days I kept waiting for the call. Every ring of the phone tightened my chest. Every unknown number made my stomach drop. At work I kept glancing through the front windows whenever a car slowed near the store. I had convinced myself someone would come in, ask for William, and that would be it. Nobody came. But then a week later my aunt called. She had been helping settle my mother's paperwork. Casual voice, ordinary conversation, until she mentioned an insurance reimbursement she couldn't locate. She said she thought there should have been a check. My heart started hammering so hard I had to sit down. I told her I hadn't seen anything. That was the second crime, and somehow it felt worse than the first. My aunt didn't accuse me. That would have been easier. She just kept asking practical questions. Had I checked the desk? The kitchen drawer? The stack of unopened mail by the phone? Her voice stayed calm, but every ordinary detail felt like pressure. She knew exactly where my mother kept things. So did I. I told her I'd look again. After we hung up, I went back to the apartment and opened the same drawers I'd already emptied. I wasn't searching anymore. I was performing innocence for an empty room. That was when guilt stopped being abstract. At the bank I had felt fear. Now I felt the shape of what I had actually done. I hadn't stolen from a faceless company. I had taken something connected to my mother, then lied to someone who loved her. For the next few days I started rehearsing explanations. I told myself the money kept us afloat. I told myself it went to rent, bills, my sister's tuition. Every justification worked for about 30 seconds, then collapsed. About 2 weeks later, the bank called. I was at work stocking paint cans when my manager shouted that there was a phone call for me in the office. The second I heard that, every muscle in my body locked up. I knew before I even picked up the receiver. A woman introduced herself from the branch. Her voice was polite, almost casual. She said they were reviewing paperwork connected to recently closed accounts and needed clarification about the insurance check. I could barely hear the rest over the sound of blood in my ears. She asked when I had found it, whether my mother had signed it in my presence, whether anyone else had access to the apartment. I answered carefully. Too carefully, probably. Short sentences. Nothing volunteered. Every word felt like stepping across thin ice. When the call ended, I stood there staring at the wall so long my manager asked if I was sick. That whole night I didn't sleep. For the first time, I stopped thinking about getting away with it. I started thinking about what confession would sound like. The next morning I drove to my aunt's house before I could talk myself out of it. Half the drive I kept rehearsing versions that made me sound less deliberate. I panicked. I wasn't thinking clearly. I meant to tell you later. By the time I parked, every sentence felt dishonest in a new way. She opened the door, saw my face, and knew something was wrong immediately. I told her everything. Not elegantly. Not in order. It came out in pieces: the check, the signature, the bank, the phone call. At some point I started crying so hard I had to sit down. I hadn't cried at the funeral. That morning it hit all at once. She didn't yell. That was worse. She just looked at me with this exhausted, wounded disbelief and asked, "Why didn't you ask for help?" I didn't have a good answer. Pride, maybe? Panic. Shame. Some ugly mixture of all three. She said she was angry, but more than that, she was sad that I had carried it alone until it turned into this. In the end, I wasn't arrested. My aunt helped me contact the bank and the insurance company. There were humiliating conversations, paperwork, and a repayment arrangement that took me nearly a year to finish. I thought every meeting would end with handcuffs. It never did. Maybe because the amount was small. Maybe because I admitted it before things went further. Maybe because I got luckier than I deserved. For a long time I told myself the lesson was simple: don't forge signatures. That's true, but it isn't the real lesson. The real danger starts earlier, when fear narrows your thinking until every problem becomes private, every burden becomes yours alone, and survival starts sounding smarter than honesty. That's the moment to pay attention. What changed me wasn't almost getting caught. It was seeing how fast desperation made me become someone unrecognizable to myself. So if you ever find yourself standing where I stood, talk to somebody before you start solving the wrong problem. Silence is where the worst decisions grow. A few years passed before I understood something else about that day. For a long time, I treated it like an isolated event, one desperate afternoon, one bad decision, one ugly chapter one could file away. But memory doesn't work like that. Certain things still pull me right back there. Standing in line at a bank. The smell of old paper. Seeing someone sign a form without thinking about it. I still have one of my mother's notebooks. Not because I'm sentimental enough to call it a keepsake. More because I kept it as evidence against myself. Sometimes I open it and look at her real handwriting. It reminds me how close love and panic can sit next to each other, and how easily grief can disguise itself as practicality. I don't tell many people this story in real life. But if you're reading it because you're scared, broke, ashamed, or cornered, tell somebody the truth early. Problems survive in darkness. Once you start hiding them, they start teaching you who you can become.